Hello and good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this talk, and thank you very much to the conference organizing and to the great conference team who have put such an amazing event together. And I hope you guys had some good and very strong coffee this morning, because this topic might be a bit boring. No, just kidding. I'll try to make it a bit lighter. So let's get started. Why this topic? Why do we need to talk about security in IT contracts? And especially, why do we need to do this as security professionals? Well, there are two sides to the security. There is the very interesting technical part, and we have seen many talks at this conference with many exploits, new techniques, and this is all very nice and fun. But we also have our day-to-day jobs, and especially in today's economy where everything is connected, where we have so many interdependencies between multiple organizations, we deal one way or another with contracts and with the consequences of IT contracts in general on a daily basis. You are actually more likely to have to deal with a contract than with an actual security breach. And this is why we have to do it. And it's also very important for us as security professionals with the organizations that we work for to pay attention to how security is put into IT contracts. Because if we don't do it right, then we will end up spending a lot of time dealing with escalations, dealing with contractual breaches, and that will prevent us, first of all, from doing the jobs that we like, from working on the threat hunting, on doing the research that we like, or working with the firewalls and the security infrastructure and securing the cloud and all the good stuff that we like. And I'm sure that you guys prefer to do that than to deal with contractual escalations. And of course, if we don't do it right, we put our companies at risk. And what I'm trying to instill through the talk today is the idea that we as security professionals have to play a bigger role in how IT contracts, and not just security contracts, all IT contracts are being written. A few words about myself. I'm Sebastian Avarvarei. I work as Director for Security Advisory Services at Wolters Kluwer in Europe. I have been in IT and security for over 20 years, and during this time I have dealt with more contracts than I care to remember, and I have seen those contracts from various sides. I've been a developer, I have been a consultant, I have been an architect, I have been an auditor, and this way I gain different perspectives on contracts, and I have also suffered from a lot of the consequences of the problems that I'm going to talk about today. Fortunately, I came from a technical background, and I'm therefore able to understand the technical side of things, but I also learned to appreciate the importance of security management, on security governance, and understanding the business side and the business implications of security. And not in the least, I'm a great fan of the InfoSec community. I think it's a community where we really put our step forward and we do a lot of work, not only to secure things, but also to share our knowledge. And events like this conference are a great example how we can help each other, how we can learn from each other. Now, to start with the topic, and to start with the original sin, the real root of all evils, where do most problems start in IT contract and security? We don't put always security in those contracts. It's maybe today a bit less prevalent than it used to be, but I still see many contracts where security is either completely missing or just mentioned somewhere as a footnote. And what happens when we do that? If we don't put security in the contract from the beginning, it's always difficult, and you have to actually fight to get it done later. Because once the contract is signed, it's always very difficult to change. So you have to think about security in advance. And this applies to everything in security, we know very well. For anything that we do, if we don't plan for security from the beginning, like in an application, if you don't design security in the application from the start, it's much more difficult to do it later. And we have to put security in the contracts, not just for the security itself. Today, security is just another quality aspect of IT. Every IT service, every IT product must have security as a quality aspect. And any quality aspect that you want to get from your supplier, you put it in the contract. If you want to have a certain uptime for your infrastructure, you mention that in the contract. Likewise, if you want to have security in the product that you're buying or in the services that a supplier is providing for you, you have to mention that in the contract. And remember, anything that you don't put in the contract, you don't get it. Nobody does things for free, or except for very few volunteering organizations, but in the commercial world, if it's not in the contract, you will not get it. If you don't require security in the contract, you will not get that security. Now, moving to the next problem, and continuing with the Star Wars theme. Yeah, I have to warn you, there are going to be a lot of movie references in this presentation. Don't worry if you don't get them all. It simply means that you have a healthier lifestyle than I do, and you don't spend so much time as I do in front of a TV screen. But as you remember, after the first Star Wars trilogy, we had the Phantom Menace. Well, this is what I call the Phantom Clause Menace. It's something you see quite often in many contracts. The famous statement, the supplier shall follow the customer security policies, which sounds good in theory. What could be wrong with this? Why is it a menace? Well, it's a menace because very few contracts, very few companies are doing it right. First of all, I haven't seen many contracts actually specifying what are the security policies. We work in different organizations, and we have seen that security policies is, more often than not, a very large set of documents. And everybody uses different names, security policies, security guidelines, security standards, and you have to specify in the contract what are the actual documents which make up your security policies. Most contracts don't even specify the versions. What is the security policy version that the contract is based on? Where do you get those security policies? You are a supplier. You have signed a new contract with a customer, and the customer tells you that you have to be compliant with their security policies. Do you have an agreement of where exactly do you get those security policies? When you don't have these clear specifications in the contract, this leads to a lot of problems. And I will try to give examples through this talk. Of course, I will not disclose any names, but these are cases that have actually happened. I remember a case with, it was a telco company, which had a very extensive set of security policies. Very well written, very detailed. They covered a lot of things in those security policies. One small problem. They never mentioned those policies specifically in the contract. And that company had a lot of suppliers. They were changing suppliers regularly. They were doing new contracts. And the security team of that customer spent a huge amount of time with each supplier, dealing with escalations, stemming from the fact that the suppliers were not aware of those security policies, and they had to do the same things over and over again. Same discussions. Yes, we have this in the security policies. Yes, you have to do it this way, not your way. It's a problem that could have been very easily solved by putting those specifications in the contract. What are the security policies? Which versions, where to get them from? Now, let's say you have done the contract. You have worked with your contract team as security professionals. You have convinced them to put explicitly which security policies, documents have to be part of the contract. What happens when you get a new version? Because we do change our security policies. I mean, most companies have at least a yearly cycle when they review and update the policies to deal with new security threats, to keep up with the developments in the industries. Who pays for those changes? And this is one of the things that you need to plan in advance for. You need to put in the contract at least a requirement that such procedures for dealing with changes in the policies have to exist. You don't want to leave that open because that's going to be a few months of negotiations between the supplier and the customer at every policy change. Think about putting that procedural requirement in the contract from the beginning. And make sure that you have some agreements in place about who is going to pay for those changes. Because changes in security policies can be sometimes expensive. They might go outside the normal scope of the contract, and you don't want to have over and over again discussions about, now, I don't want to pay for this because I have the contract with you, the supplier says, no, but this is something different from what we agreed, and it all comes down to the money. You have to think about these things. And I remember a case with a manufacturing company. They had a security policy, and they updated 1 year, and they introduced through the security policies a very good requirement that every major change in the IT systems, every major project in IT must have a very extensive risk assessment performed, and the supplier of that project needs to provide a very comprehensive set of risk analysis documents with everything as quantified as possible. That meant hundreds and even thousands of extra hours of work for their suppliers. That was work that was not planned before. And now those companies, instead of actually doing the work that they wanted to do, instead of working on the actual project, spent time dealing with the endless discussions about financial terms and how do we solve this. And by the way, you will see in some of the contracts, you will see the term imposition of costs. That's the legal term that you have to use in the contract to specify who is responsible for paying for things. Because contracts are about money. Another problem that I see, you have written a contract. Again, you have put all the details in there, you thought about procedures, you are prepared to deal with the changes, and you know exactly which policies you have to comply with. Have you actually read them? You would be surprised in how many contracts, and I'm talking about large contracts, in millions and tens of millions and more, where it turned out that nobody actually read the security policies before signing the contract. Nobody actually, they accepted that the security policies have to be followed, they are part of the contractual requirements, but nobody in the supplier side have actually read those security policies. And in most contracts, you have, or you should have, a phase called due diligence. That's when you get to know your business partner, you get some insight into the activities, you find out how reliable or trustworthy your business partner is. Part of that understanding of your business partner should be understanding their security policies. You have to actually read them. And you as security team have to be involved in that process. And not involved as in, let's just do a rubber stamp and approve this 2 days before signing the contract. No, you have to, you have to actually go through the security policies. And if there is anything that you think might be a risk for your company, something that you might not be able to deliver, or something that might impact the costs of the services or the products that you are delivering, you have to flag that. You are the ones as security professionals who can understand the actual requirements in the security policies, which are part of the contract, and translate that to the business colleagues. You have to explain them, this is what happens if we agree to these security policies. Example, I saw a contract with a very large financial organization. They decided to outsource the infrastructure. It was, I think, close to 200 or 300 million euros. Very large contract. And the outsourcing party was happy. They started to work. They started to design the whole new infrastructure with the network, the data storage, everything, how everything will be virtualized, moved to the cloud, how everything will look like. What they didn't do, they didn't read the policies. And they didn't notice that in the policies for that customer, they had a very strict requirement that they have to follow the principle of micro-segmentation in network design. So after they finalized the design phase and they were already buying the products, the systems that they needed to run the infrastructure for that client, they went to the customer for approval. The customer showed the design to the security team, and the security team said, no. All those months of work have to be scrapped away. All the designs start from scratch. Equipment that was ordered had to be returned. And actually, it was one of the factors that contributed to that contract to be broken. And when you break a contract on this level, it's terribly expensive and terribly damaging for both companies, both for the supplier, who has lost a lot of money and has lost reputation, but also for the customer. So even if you are working for a customer, that is a problem for you as well, because everything gets put on hold, everything is delayed with a year or more, and all those strategic programs that you are working on are delayed. So make sure you actually read the security policies, and if you are on the customer side, make sure that you ask your supplier, have you read my security policies? Do you actually understand what do you need to comply with? Now, I've been talking about what I don't see sufficiently enough in contracts. Let me tell you about one thing that I see and I don't like to see. It's something that it keeps repeated, and I don't want to see it anymore. Best practices. We see this sentence being very frequently used in contracts. The supplier shall follow industry best practice, or the supplier shall follow security best practices. Yeah, best practices are good. You know, when you're talking in abstract, when you're talking, it's a feel-good kind of statement. It doesn't belong in a contract. Contract is about details, and as we know, the devil is in the details. If you do want to have some best practices referenced in the contract, there are some good examples out there, but be specific. I mean, I enumerated a few of them on the slide. You have some very good best practices from OWASP, from Microsoft, from NIST, and you can find actual best practices for pretty much everything you want. But make sure you actually enumerate them in the contract. Make sure that you have a common understanding with your business partner about what is actually a best practice. Example. I was involved in a contract many years ago, and everything was going well until we got to the implementation phase, and we started to discuss with the security team from the customer. And they had an understanding of what is best practice for encryption, which they took to be 2048 bit for encryption keys on our side as a supplier, we were still on the standard that 1024-bit is sufficient. As I told you, it was some time ago when we were still transitioning from 1024 to 1048-bit encryption keys. And it wasn't just a theoretical, abstract problem. The problem was that being able to work with the longer encryption keys required a lot of upgrades, a lot of extra work that we as suppliers have to do, requires in many cases to upgrade certain pieces of hardware. That was a very significant financially difference between our positions. And it's something that, because it was not clear in the contract what is the best practice, we could have referenced maybe to the OWASP best practices for encryption as the baseline, and we would have a common standard. Because we didn't do that, we had to spend a lot of time in the negotiations. And yeah, I agree kind of with you, but I don't quite want to do it because it's too expensive. Another thing, similar with the best practices, we see quite often in the contracts statements like the supplier shall be compliant, and you have all kind of regulations, either for specific industries or general ones. You have ISO, PCI DSS, GDPR, NIST, or you have banking regulations, and those are listed in the contract, and it says that the supplier has to be compliant with that. Well, I have also seen that in many situations, the suppliers don't actually know what those regulations are. They do not understand what are the implications of those requirements from the regulations and the standards that they said that they are going to be compliant with. Also, I've seen many contracts where they don't specify what is the scope of applicability for a certain standard. I mean, if you take something like PCI DSS and you have outsourced your infrastructure, it doesn't mean that all your infrastructure has to be PCI DSS. It doesn't mean that the supplier has to be PCI DSS compliant for everything. No, they have to be PCI DSS compliant just for the systems which are in scope. And likewise with GDPR, with HIPAA, you have to be specific. What is the scope of applicability for every regulations and framework that you require? If you are on the supplier side, if you are working as a security professional for a supplier of IT services, you have to check with your actual delivery teams if they can deliver to that standard. You are the ones who have to do the translation between that security regulation to actual deliverable items that they have to provide. Also on the customer side, so if you're working on the security team of the customer, you have to make sure that you collect the necessary regulations from all the stakeholders. You have to actually go to the business divisions and ask them, for your part of the business, what do you have to be compliant with? Are you doing something with medical systems? Do we have to require our supplier to be HIPAA compliant? PCI DSS, GDPR, do we work with European data? Okay, you have to make sure that you collect all those details from all the stakeholders, because, as I said earlier, if you don't put all your requirements in the contracts from the beginning, it's much more expensive and difficult to change it later. And just as I mentioned with the security policies, remember that regulations also change from time to time. We had recently a new version of PCI DSS. We had a new regulation called GDPR being introduced. Make sure you have some provisions in the contract. How do you deal with changes in the regulatory framework? Who is, again, just like with the security policies, who pays for the changes? Who is responsible for the implementation of new policies? Even the assessment of determining the implications of introducing a new regulation. Even that is a non-trivial amount of work that should be quantified in financial terms somewhere in the contract. And as an example, I remember a case with somebody working in Switzerland. In Switzerland, they have some very strict banking regulations. There's a regulation called FINMA, which puts a lot of details about how data needs to be handled, how it has to be encrypted, who is authorized to touch customer data, can you give access to non-Swiss partners to your data. It's quite a good regulation. But in one case, the supplier didn't quite pay attention, didn't read all the details of the FINMA. They signed the contract, they said, yeah, okay, we're going to deliver your IT services, we're going to provide you with data storage, and they actually bought very nice devices, ignoring the fact that FINMA requires storage data encryption. And they had to throw away those devices, buy new, more expensive ones, which were more expensive than what they foreseen in the contract. Again, very expensive mistake, and a mistake that also delayed the contract, and it soured the relation between the customer and the supplier, and you don't want to get on the bad side of a Swiss banking institution. And speaking of compliance, we say that the customer, or sorry, the supplier shall be compliant with this and that. And of course, between business partners, we trust each other. We trust our business partners, but we always verify. And this is something that I learned when I was working as auditor. Always trust, but verify. It's like Santa Claus. You know, he's making the list, he's checking it twice. And we have to do the same thing in security. We have to check everything, and if possible, check it twice. Why? Because if we don't check things, security becomes full of surprises. And security is an area where you don't like surprises. We don't want to have security surprises. You want to know exactly what kind of chocolate are you going to get from that security box. And how do you solve this? With a number of things. First of all, if you say that the supplier has to be compliant with certain regulations or with a certain framework, make sure that you also include in the contract requirements that they have to provide actual compliance statements, that they have to prove to you on an ongoing basis that they're still compliant with that regulation. If it's something like a requirement for SOC 2 compliance, you have to put in the contract that the supplier is obligated to provide you their yearly SOC 2 compliance report. Also very important, put metrics about security in the contracts. It's something that I very rarely see. And in IT, in the general IT, they are more advanced than we are in security. If you look at the IT part of a contract, you find a lot of SLAs and KPIs. You have a lot of actual measurable definitions about how the quality of the IT service is being measured. What did I say in the beginning? Security is just another quality aspect of IT. Therefore, it should be very measurable. And there are some very good books and some very good materials on metrics for the security field. There are metrics for pretty much anything you can imagine in security. The only thing we need to do is to actually specify those metrics in the contracts. Next to that, make sure that in your contracts for IT services, you have specific requirements for auditing and for pen testing. We do it, but not sufficiently well, and I will get into that topic a bit more. And for all those points, for the compliance reporting, for the metrics, for the the pen testing and auditing, you have to answer in the contract to 4 questions. Who, how, sorry, that's 3 questions. Who, how, and how often. Who is going to do it? Who is going to actually send the compliance reports? Who is going to do the pen testing? Who is going to measure things? How? How is it going to be measured? How is it going to be audited? How is it going to be pen tested? And how often? How often do you need to get those reports? How often do you get pen tested? How often do you measure the security SLAs and KPIs? Of course, when we say that we need to have pen tests and audits in the contract, it doesn't mean that everything goes. There have to be limits. We have to define in the contracts, both if we are on the customer and on the supplier side, what are the boundaries for pen tests and audits. What is allowed, and what do we say, no, you will not do that. On the auditing side, things are usually a bit better because auditing requirements in the contracts are written usually with the support of the guys from the legal and from the auditing departments, and they have a bit more experience than we do in writing things in contracts, and we could actually learn a thing or two from them. But when it comes to right to audit, you have to specify in the contract the frequency of the audits, how much notice as auditing party do you need to give to the other party, how much work is the supplier supposed to put for free in the execution of the audit, if more work is needed, how is the extra amount of work paid for. Details, but a lot of details that have to be covered. It's quite similar with the pen tests. Where is pen test allowed? In the contract, you have to say, is our pen test accepted for production or for development? Are there any specific systems that are maybe even excluded from the pen test because for one reason or another, they cannot be done? Or maybe you have certain time frames when you really don't want to allow pen tests. If you are in the retail industry, around Christmas time is not a good time to pen test your systems. Who is allowed to do the pen test? As the supplier of the IT service, do you want to allow the security team of your customer to pen test you? Or do you require that, okay, if you're going to pen test me, then you need to hire a certified external pen test teams? Also specify what can you do or not do with the reports from audits and the pen tests. Can you share them? With whom? And obviously, pay extra attention for those for the definitions of the pen testing and auditing requirements in systems where you have multiple customers or which are managed by multiple parties. Think about cloud systems. Can you pen test everything? No, because you might be pen testing the system of another customer or of another supplier. And one example that I've seen at some point was that there was a contract where it was mandated that the pen tests can be done only against non-production systems. It was mostly about pen testing applications, and they said, yep, you can test our applications in the non-production side, so you can find anything that we missed in our development phase. Accidentally, somebody sent to the pen testing team the IP address of the production. And the pen tester didn't realize that. And there was a small problem. That production system they were pen testing, they actually found vulnerabilities. They got into the database, they were looking at the data, and they realized they're looking at actual legal cases, actual trials that were ongoing on quite sensitive matters. So that's why it's important to be very clear about what is allowed and not allowed, and also make sure that all the parties involved in the delivery of those contracts understand what are the limitations for audits and pen tests. An area where security is very important, but ironically gets ignored quite a lot, is outsourcing. it's 2018. We have been doing outsourcing for what, a decade or more. Everything gets outsourced. Infrastructure, software development, security. We have so many suppliers for managed security services. And yet when I look at many security contracts, I see that security is very poorly written in there. And that is quite often because when a company wants to outsource something, they say, well, this service that I was doing before, it has impeccable security. This is from Monty Python with the Black Knight. He keeps chopping there, his hands, his legs, and oh, I'm still good to fight. Customers who outsource their services say the same. Well, I'm outsourcing the software development. Everything that I have done so far, the application that I have been developing, is bulletproof security. If there is any problem, it's only something that you as outsourcer has introduced. So that's why it's important, especially if you are working in the security team of an outsourcing company. Make sure that before you accept that outsourcing contract, you take a baseline and you note that baseline for security in the contract. And baseline can be many things. You have to be creative on your specific case, but look at things like take backups of the source code. So you are sure that if there's a problem later, you can prove, well, this bug existed before I took over the code. Look at audit reports, vulnerability scans that the customer might already have. And write everything down. Make a note of what security controls are in place and especially what kind of security controls are missing. So if there is a discussion later, you can say to the customer, yeah, you didn't have this security control before. You cannot ask me to deliver it now if you didn't have it. Well, if you want it, it's an extra service. Also in the outsourcing contracts, make sure that you have requirements about how long the supplier is allowed to take to fix security issues, and who is responsible for fixing those issues. And in relation to these 2 points, I remember a case, again, with an outsourcing company that took over the whole IT system of a certain company. About a year after the outsourcing, they had a security audit. There were quite a few findings. Because they didn't have that baseline, they couldn't prove that they were not the ones who created the security issues, and therefore they ended up paying for fixing security issues that existed before they took over the contract. Quite expensive. Also in outsourcing contract, you have to be very clear about how the security responsibilities will be divided, because you have your IT systems or your applications, and part of the activities are still going to be done by you. Some of the activities are going to be done by the outsourcing parties. Where is the border, the separation line between the security responsibilities of the 2 parties? Now, after outsourcing, and actually something that I see in the outsourcing contract, there's a phrase in my favorite book, which obviously is Dune. There's a phrase there: "He who controls the spies controls the universe." Sounds very catchy. This applies very well also to access control systems. When you do outsource, and in general, when you enter in a contract for some IT service with a certain party, you need to be clear. What are the rules for creating accounts? What are the rules for accessing data? What kind of data can be accessed? So if you outsource your software development, is the outsourcing party allowed to access the production data, or are they supposed to work only with non-production data? Write it down. What can they do? What are the requirements for your supplier to work on your system? You might have requirements saying, well, I have some very critical systems. I only want people who have a security background check, or even a certain security certification to work on those particular systems. Might not be applicable to everything, but in some situations, I've been working with airports where they said, yeah, everything that we do, if somebody is touching it, that person must have a government security clearance. And specify how are you going to check those things? How are you going to check if the access control rules are actually enforced? And because we've been talking about things that might create issues, when you think about issues, you have to think about liability. It's a term that is, if you do a search for movies in IMDb, you find quite a few movies and TV series with liability in the title. We should use that word even more in security contracts, because liability is about who pays for when things go wrong, who takes the responsibility for things going wrong. And things do go wrong quite often. You've seen the Aliens, and you've seen pretty much every sci-fi movie where things go wrong constantly. Security is pretty much like sci-fi movies. Everything goes wrong at some point. And especially in the security context, think about what could go wrong from a security perspective or by a security person. I remember a case of a security pen tester accidentally dropping the production database. Who is liable? Who pays for all that downtime? Is the pen tester liable, or do they have a liability waiver that was written in the contract which says, no, we take absolutely no responsibilities for what we break? Make sure that your contract is clear about those liabilities. And of course, on the vendor side, all the vendors try to shield themselves from the liabilities, starting with the, if you read the end user agreements for every software, no software vendor takes any liability for anything. Same in security. You can transfer some of those liabilities, but not everything is possible. There are some regulations that might say, this liability, you cannot transfer it in no form whatsoever. And remember that it can go both ways. So regardless if you are working for a supplier or for a customer, as a security professional, you have to think about liability, because there can be issues caused by each party to the other. The supplier can cause issues for the customer, or the customer can trigger issues for a supplier. You have to cover all those situations. And the last lesson that I'm going to put to the screen today is not to make assumptions. Because assumptions make life interesting, but not necessarily in an interesting and pleasant way. It's like a Doctor Who episode. When you make assumptions, things will deviate in all kinds of strange ways. Do not make assumptions when it comes to security in the contracts. Make sure that if you want something to happen in the security context, don't pray for it, write it down. And I'll give an example here with a company, also in an outsourcing context. The customer had a very good, very strong security team. The outsourcing party assumed that that security team will remain in place after outsourcing. Guess what? About 3 months after the outsourcing contract was signed, the security team of the customer has been seriously downsized, and the supplier had to do a lot of security work, and they had to bring security consultants to do a lot of security work that they assumed that the security team of the customer will do. It was not cheap. And don't forget to apply to everything the trust and verify. Even if you write it down, don't assume that just by writing it down in the contract is going to get done. Check it, verify it, audit it, pen test it, always. So this is basically the Decalogue, and I will summarize the points that I've gone through today. By the way, it's called a Decalogue-ish because initially I thought that it's going to be 10. I found that actually quite a few more issues. I limited to 12 today, but trust me, you can find quite a few more. But if you do at least these 12 things, you are going to be in a much better shape than most companies are today. So here is very briefly the Decalogue again. When you make an IT contract, put security requirements in it. Make sure you are clear about what are the security policies which apply to that contract. Make sure that you are prepared for changes in those policies. Make sure that you actually read the security policies and requirements that you refer into the contract. Do not use the term best practice. Make sure you understand any framework, any set of regulations that is mentioned in the contract. Make sure that you actually measure the quality of the security services. Make sure that you have security metrics, and make sure that you put clear boundaries and definitions about how pen tests and audits are being performed. If you do outsourcing, make sure you take a good baseline of the security level before outsourcing. Make sure you take care of the access rights. Make sure that you talk about liabilities, and do not make assumptions. Well, just in a very few minutes, next to this Decalogue, I will share a few more lessons that I learned about contracts and how to deal with security in contracts. First of all, the biggest lesson I learned, Murphy was an optimist. Things go wrong. That's why we need to have clear contracts, because things will go wrong. It's not something that can go wrong will go wrong. Everything will go wrong, period. But maybe even more important, security is not about security. We don't do security just for the sake of playing with technical things. In most organizations, especially in the commercial world, we do security to help the business, to protect the business, and to enable the business to work. And remember that you can either be a driver of culture, you can change the culture and instill security in the culture of your organization, or you can let the organization impose the culture on you. It's a choice. But I prefer the position where we as security professionals take the initiative and we help the culture of our organizations to be more security focused. The other lesson that I've seen over and over again, if as a security team you are not involved from the beginning in the contracts, you will be involved much more in escalations. So take it as a time investment. If you spend some time working with the contract team, it will save you a lot of time later. And work with those commercial teams in advance. Don't come to them with security requirements 3 days before signing the contract. Work with them in advance. Explain what security is about, explain your security policies, explain what are the principles. Help them to actually write standard templates for their contracts. And they will support you. They will fight in the contracts for your security requirements. But if you leave it until the last minute, they will fight against you. Because, very simple, their bonus is based not on what happens after the contract signing. Their bonus is based if the contracts get signed, and they want to get it signed as quickly as possible. And some of the best contracts that I've seen are the contracts where the people who are actually involved in consuming and delivering those services were actually involved in writing those contracts, on the same principle of if it's done right from the beginning in the contract, it creates much less headaches in the end. So, as a security professional involved with a contractual team, make sure that any other stakeholder that you might be dependent on also has a voice in the contract negotiation. And I know that for some security people, dealing with contracts, with legal, seems like, oh, this is not something that I do. This is something outside of my scope of interest. Not true. It's like threat modeling. It's very simple threat modeling. You think about what could go wrong, and you put that in a contract, and you put a mitigation for it in the contract. That's all it is. That's what our work supporting the writing of IT contracts is about, just threat modeling. So this is what I had for today. Thank you very much for listening.